Okay, so sounds on. Welcome to PuppetCamp. It's sort of quite strange being on this side. I'm normally on that side, so see how it goes. So as Gary nice to introduce me, I'm Gareth Tushkov. I'm one of the senior software engineers at Puppet Labs. I'm Gareth R pretty much everywhere on the internet if you want to find me, ask questions or complain. Do talk about PuppetCamp. Let us know what you find interesting, what you don't find interesting, who you liked, who said good things, and prefix them with PuppetCamp, and we'll find them on the internet. And before I get into anything actually interesting, if people could turn their phones off. I think the signal in here is actually pretty weak anyway, so but phones off, appreciated, or at least muted if you're on call. As well, thanks to all our sponsors, SolidFire, PagerDuty, Spearhead, and NetBuilder. Without them, it's difficult to do things that are quite this big and quite this as nice a venue as this. So do let them know that you appreciate their efforts. And I'll start out with asking you loads of questions. It's always interesting to find out who comes along to these events. So, if you've been to one before, you've probably you'll heard these questions before. But who in the room would sort of describe themselves as a systems administrator? Lots of hands, but not everyone. Who would describe themselves more as a developer? Less hands? Who would say they're confused and somewhere in between? Good scattering of hands. I'm definitely confused and somewhere in between. Another interesting axis as well is sort of how long have people been using Puppet? So let's start out with who's never used Puppet before? Wow, lots of hands. And so remember that when you're talking to people. I think everyone assumes, oh, it's PuppetCamp, it's loads of hardcore Puppet people. Actually, there's loads of people here who've never used it before. So now let's put your hands up if you are using Puppet at all. Excellent. If you keep your hands up. Keep going. Keep your hands up if you've been using Puppet for more than a year. A bunch of hands go down. More than 2 years? More than 3 years? Still some hands up. More than 4 years? Still one hand up. Oh, 2 hands up. More than 5 years? I think we've got a winner. So, Puppet's been around for a while, and it's interesting to see the sort of how that went in terms of there's a bunch of people who've been around the community using the tool for a long time, and then there's a growing number of people who've been adopting it more recently, and we're getting people along who haven't used it at all before. So, bear that in mind talking to people, talk to them about your experiences, and I think you'll be able to find people with similar experiences, but also people with more experience and people you can help as well. So, this talk is really hopefully setting the scene for everything we're going to talk about today. And I'll start out really by describing a bit of, a problem and environment that lots of you are probably familiar with. And I'm going to make the sort of simplifying statement up front that systems administration is hard. And I think not only that, it's getting harder, it's getting more complicated, it's getting more pressurized. And the life of your typical systems administrator isn't necessarily an easy one. Some of the things that fit into that sort of catch-all operations roles can be not only difficult but tedious. They can be sort of frustrating, which is sometimes fun, sometimes not. But they can also be completely invisible unless you do it wrong, at which point they're very, very visible. And that can be quite stressful. I think a lot of, the questions around sort of stereotypes and generalizing sort of systems administrators and developers isn't always fair because lots of people span lots of things. But one thing that's definitely a characterization of the operations and the systems roles tends to be they're interrupted every 15 minutes. They're very interrupt driven. And as developers will often be telling you that it takes half an hour to get back your mental state if you're doing something that you need to focus on. If you're being interrupted every 50 minutes, that's a little bit difficult to do. So it's hard and potentially getting harder. But it's also super important. It's super critical. It's increasingly like being seen as an enabler for businesses to go faster. It's a strategic advantage to have good operations, to have your infrastructure able to move as quickly as you want it to do. Technology has to be increasingly, for like modern organizations, like a competitive advantage, because if it's not, it's probably an advantage for one of your competitors. There's also, I think, been maybe sort of like the back end, like sort of, well, going back 15 years or so ago, there was definitely a sort of desire to outsource all of this just stuff. It was bog standard stuff, anyone could do it, you just wanted it out of your business, someone else would do it for you. And that's reversing. I think because some of the organizations that ultimately came in and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to see this as something that we do in-house, that is an advantage. They won. They went faster, they got bigger. And I think a lot of organizations are now looking to sort of in-source that again. So you've got this large organizations bringing those skills back in-house. You've got the sort of explosion of startups and companies providing products in this space. And suddenly you've got a lot of competition, which is good for us, but also probably means, in some cases, working with less people. Organizations, infrastructure, code, whatever, there's just pressure everywhere to move faster, to be able to have a feedback loop that allows you to not just release something, not just get something out there into the world, but actually change it on the second day and third day and fourth day to make it better. You're not going to be right on the first time. So it's not about projects that end on the day of delivery. It's about products that start when you first ship something. So hopefully this is sounding somewhat familiar to people. And one of the other sort of things coming in from the side as well is I guess outsourcing in a different way. It's not the people, it's not the skills, it's not the business domain knowledge. It's the software. So whether that's software as a service, whether it's not running your own hardware, whether it's running on a public cloud or having like API-driven infrastructure. We're suddenly managing very different things. We need different types of structures, different types of skills. It's all got quite complicated. And there are emerging patterns that are definitely the way to go. Whether that's immutable infrastructure, whether that's containers, whether that's platform as a service, sort of like, there are always things coming over the horizon that are better. They're extracted from best practices, they're extracted from companies that got these things right, and then they're productized. But that happens unevenly, it happens unequally, and we're constantly having to sort of relearn our trade. The world of a systems administrator generally, like, again, there's always sort of a curves of adoption, from 20 years ago is different to what it is today. And I think the idea that 20 years ago you'd have as many developers talking about something that's very much about the infrastructure and operations is a sign of that. The good news is what we do matters. And the even better news is that we're starting to see efforts to quantify that, which makes the arguments internally about saying we want to do this better, we want to be better, we want to adopt new approaches. It's much easier to sell to organizations when it's not just someone on the internet said it was a good idea, I think we should do that. It's when there's emerging sort of social science behind things. Like, we're not there yet, but the DevOps survey that's just closed for this year, the data from last year, crunching that, threw up some things that weren't, I think everyone was a bit shocked at the actual, like, how good the numbers were. And it'll be interesting to see how that pans out this year. And just in terms of, and some of the things that were pulled out on the slides, twice the change success rate, like twice, not a bit, like twice, and 12 times faster to fix problems that emerged. And this was from a sample of, like, I think, certainly several thousand companies, several thousand organizations. And the science behind it is interesting, and when we publish the new report, definitely check that out. So, everything's moving faster, everything's getting more complicated, and you're in the thick of it. And that's where Puppet Labs, where Puppet comes in. And what we're trying to do is provide tools to you so that, like, that confluence of things, that desire to move faster, like that explosion of new technologies, and the sudden realization that actually it's a competitive advantage to do what you do well. How can we make you better? How can we give you power tools? A lot of that is around automation, and that's been the sort of, I guess, path. The sort of the realization that scaling people is difficult. Scaling manual processes is difficult. I came back to, like, there's always a sense that some aspects of operations are repetitive, but where it's just repetition for repetition's sake, can't we get a computer to do it? And there are issues around trusting automation. There are ways of actually adopting code and coding practices that are often coming from the development side that allows us to build that trust. But where can we automate things to allow you then to focus on your business, to the things that are specific to you? So Puppet as a tool ships with support for lots of the types of things that you're managing day to day. You can extend Puppet to support other things, but just as examples, if you're installing packages by hand, if you're tweaking the contents of files by hand, you're setting up cron jobs and users by hand across lots of computers. Bearing in mind that you're probably going to have lots more computers in the future. You're going to, even with the best runbook, even with the best Word document you could possibly write, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to do that wrong. Automation is really the only scalable way of doing that, at any reasonable cost, at least. The sort of Puppet approach to this is based around a domain-specific language. So the idea is that you define in the Puppet language, in a programming language, that what the state of the system you want, how you want the system to be, the desired state. You're not saying install this, you're saying I want this thing to be installed. So up front, we're defining our infrastructure. We're then able to test those changes. And it's fine to sort of describe something, but we want to be able to make sure that actually that description is mapping to what you actually want to happen. So once you've described something, you can test it. You can test it whether that's fast feedback sort of loops on your local machines, whether it's testing on like a sort of staging or pre-production environment, or whether it's testing on a portion of nodes in production. Maybe you've dropped something out of the load balancer and you're making some changes and you're putting it back in. All the way through, you can be testing the application of the Puppet code that you've written. And it's not just about setting things up. I think this is one of the things that people often miss when they're first coming to automation tools, first coming to something like Puppet, is that you think the biggest problem you have is setting something up from scratch. You think the problem is, because that's your job today. Your job is to set up a new server. And you're going to do that from scratch, and you're going to use Puppet to build that. And and previously you might have done that by hand, previously you might have done that with bash scripts. And to a degree, Puppet replaces both of those with something that's not a million miles away. You're writing something that's declarative rather than imperative now, but you're still going from something, like nothing to something. You're installing all the default packages, you're putting all the users on there, you're putting all the keys on there, you're putting all the cron jobs on there. The important bit is, though, you set up a server once, but that server then keeps running. And that server might run for years, it might run for weeks, it might run for minutes, depending on how far you're down a sort of like throwing up servers and bringing them down as demand spikes. But that server is still running well after you set it up. And with Puppet, you can then enforce that state in the future. Whether you're changing that state or not, you can you can be guaranteed that it's still as it was when you set it up. And you've got the reporting and feedback to help you there. And because you've described everything in this domain-specific language, because you're using a Puppet to apply all those changes and enforce all those constraints, the data gathered by the system is huge. It's all the stuff that you would want to know. It's all the stuff that you, like in previous sort of generation tools, you would have to go and have a look on all the machines. Suddenly something is already doing that and aggregating it together. So you can pull out reports of across all of your infrastructure incredibly quickly. So that's sort of what about the how? So fundamentally, Puppet, as I said, is based around a domain-specific language. You're writing code. And I think one of the things there is that if you're, I've said it before, if you're writing Puppet, you're a software developer. That's a good thing. That means as a software developer, you can look at how best practices around software development have emerged, how they've grown. But also, with something like this, it's like, yes, it's code, but it's not complicated. It's domain specific. It's suited to the task at hand. All we're doing here is saying there should be a file at this file path. There should be an SSHD config. It should have these permissions. We're not doing anything that's rocket science, but we're able to then extract the value out of it later. And we can extend that as well. So it's not just dropping files. It's everything about your host that can be managed, everything about your entire infrastructure that can be managed. So we can build up the code to manage different things. And you can do that over time. So more specifically, I think, Puppet is a sort of declarative, idempotent, domain-specific language used for modeling your infrastructure. That sounds pretty formal, and there's some interesting words there. But I think it's the power of Puppet comes from understanding those words and how they fit. So I'm going to go all sort of dictionary on people. When we say declarative, and the dictionary says it's about serving to declare, make known, or explain. That's why you're writing this in code. You're wanting to declare that you want something. You're wanting to explain it to other people. By having a shared domain language for describing our infrastructure, suddenly all of those people who put their hands up to say, I've been using Puppet, can understand. So someone new comes in and they might already understand the language. So within your team, you've suddenly got a way of consistently describing things. And that's quite powerful. We also talked about something being idempotent. And the dictionary saying there is that that's unchanged when applied by itself. And this is where that power for not just running it once and setting something up comes from, but where we can run that code again and again and again, and it's not changing everything again. It's going to say, if you're saying, well, Apache should be installed, it's not going to install Apache every time. The first time it's going to say, hi server, is Apache installed? The server's going to say, no, Puppet's going to install Apache. The second time it runs, it's going to ask again, hey server, is Apache installed? And the server's going to say yes, and Puppet's going to say, oh, cool. I'll report back that it's already installed. So we're not having to install things over and over again. You're not having to worry about running the same code over and over again, which means you get all the lovely reporting out of it. And I always describe Puppet as a modeling tool. It is about, and for me, this is sort of why I was using Puppet sort of 4 years ago, why I kept using Puppet, was because it allowed me to take the picture in my head of how like my infrastructure worked and put that into code to be shared with other people. And that sort of modeling exercise and lends itself to a bunch of sort of like useful properties. And so the sort of definitely the dictionary description sort of comes out with some of them. A standard or example for imitation or comparison. Well, who's ever set up 2 or 3 identical environments? Or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or X, and like doing things repetitively, having them like that are basically just variations on a theme. Well, have a strong model and then apply it many times. A representation to show the construction or appearance of something. Again, we're back to something that can be shared, something that works well in a team environment. And I think that's whether you've got centralized teams, whether you've got sort of distributed teams, whether you've got multiple organizations, having that shared model that you can talk about abstracts you away from having to talk about low-level implementation details. Suddenly you can be talking about things at the right level of abstraction. And I think one of the things that I dropped this in because I'm, like, who in the room is managing anything on Windows? See, loads of hands go. And I think there's sometimes this idea that automation doesn't exist in the Windows world. And I think actually a lot of it had been for a while was just, it was a parallel community. A lot of what Microsoft has been doing recently, then like PowerShell, big fan of PowerShell, with embracing open source and the open source community, is bringing these communities together. I think we'll see lots more Windows stuff. And again, having separate tools has always been one of the barriers to sort of companies using the best tools for the job. And one of the things we're doing with Puppet is we're making sure that we've got, like, Windows is a first-class citizen. So embrace people who are Windows folks. So once you've done this upfront modeling, then this is where people talk, I say, stop talking about modeling because it gets confusing. It's like sort of, well, but I want bits on disk, I want packages installed, I want files installed, I don't want to just toddle over code and everything. So how does Puppet actually get from the code to installing things? And luckily I have a hand diagram. So one approach to this is really running a Puppet server, running something in the center. So here we've got a bunch of nodes, we've got a sort of Unix and a Linux and a Windows machine. And they're going to call home periodically. This could be, and by default this is normally half an hour, but you can do that more or less depending on what you're doing. And in this case, the Unix server is calling home and it's sending some facts. And what we mean by facts is about sort of 150 or so, like just properties of the system. Things like the network interfaces, the CPU, the operating system version, the kernel version. Any and all information that might be useful in determining what should happen on that server. The Puppet Master then is able to sort of say, right, well, based on those facts, based on a classification for that node, I'm going to compile a catalog. And all the catalog is basically, it's instructions for the machine to apply. The catalog is then sent back to Puppet on the Unix machine, and the machine's then able to take that catalog and ensure everything is in the state as described. So make sure Apache is installed, make sure that the SSHD file config has these contents in, has these permissions. And then the agent is able to send back a report about exactly what happened. So if something failed, if something didn't apply, if something was broken about your model, you get that quick feedback. And obviously then, that's just one node, but you'd have all of your nodes periodically checking in, and your infrastructure is suddenly constantly converging towards the state you want. With those reports going back, with all this information flowing around, I mentioned earlier one of the nice things about having a single tool doing this is just the data you get back. That you can then mine, you can do all sorts of interesting and novel stuff. It all goes into PuppetDB. PuppetDB is really just an interface over Postgres. So it provides a domain-specific API, so you can do lots of interesting queries that are what most people will want to do. But remember as well, it's a database, so you can go spelunking. It's probably not recommended, but I do it. So if that's the basics, what else is happening around Puppet? So one of the sort of eagle-eyed people will be thinking, well, everything's calling into this central bit, and I've got 10,000 servers or 15,000 servers or a lot of servers. That's a single central point. Is this a good thing? So some of the things that have been going on recently are around taking the what was the Puppet master and basically building the Puppet server. And this is much more sort of designed for sort of scale, designed for like resilience. It's now the default way to basically to run a Puppet master. It's based on JVM, and that's really like allowing us to be much more performant under load. There's also a lot of other interesting things coming there which will allow us to be sort of more composable, to work towards sort of a system that can take the best advantage of a distributed set of hosts automatically, rather than setting up a sort of more of a like HA type setup. So there's other things around the Puppet ecosystem as well, and it's not all just one tool. There are other individual tools that do related jobs well. It doesn't all go into one big monolith. So one of those is Razor. And I guess one of the questions I should have asked earlier, and who's running their own physical kit? Who provisions their own boxes? A good number. And I think that's again sort of, especially with communities around sort of DevOps or infrastructure automation or that sort of crossover between developer and operations. People are sort of like, oh, everyone's running everything in AWS. And it's not true. There is still this spread. People are using the best tool for the job. And Razor is all about bare metal provisioning. It's all about taking that newly racked server and getting just enough operating system on there for it to join in and do real work. And it's basically a rules-based provisioning engine for bare metal servers. You might use that to bootstrap a hypervisor. You might use that to bootstrap, like actually, if you're running something because you need the performance on the metal. And there's also mCollective as well, which is much more high levels of execution environment. So at the point where simply using SSH sort of starts to break down, mCollective is there for you. Just sort of, it provides a messaging fabric and a whole way of writing plugins to allow you to execute commands in parallel to serial across lots and lots of servers. And it does that without you having to describe, without having to sort of say, right, it's that server and that server. You can use the information on those servers to determine whether something is executed or not. So Hiera is part of that Puppet ecosystem as well. And where that fits in is basically introducing data into your code. So you don't want to couple code and data. That's a sort of common pattern in software development. Hiera allows you to inject code from external sources into your Puppet code. So that might be, and a lot of the examples will use a sort of like a YAML file or a JSON file. But actually that information might be coming from a CMDB, might be coming from a service discovery tool. And we can combine all of that information from multiple sources together and inject it into Puppet. And also, increasingly, people are starting to use R10K, which is a opinionated sort of workflow and deployment tool for Puppet. So where rather than sort of having to manually deploy your code, and there's RTK will do that for you. Rather than having to worry about how you apply a subset of code to a subset of nodes, maybe you're rolling it out in a sort of canary sort of release, and RTK will do that for you. And one of the sort of big sort of flashing things that gets a big orange slide is Puppet 4 is now available. This brings with it a lot of changes and also loads of really good stuff. And so if people have not been using the future parser, so basically Puppet had a new parser and that's been sort of gestating in the sort of 3 series. That's now the default in 4. I'm increasingly using features from the 4 language, and I'll talk about some of them in a moment. And also the all-in-one package makes installing Puppet so much easier. Like not having to worry too much about the Ruby dependency is so nice. Obviously, Puppet Labs is a company, and we do a lot of work on the open source products. And we also have commercial software as well. And the idea there is that we can provide the best tools to everyone by providing sort of high-level tools to some. And Puppet Enterprise really adds sort of this concept of pre-built applications, Puppet apps, on top of Puppet, on top of a sort of the open source core. So things like fine-grained permissions, things like role-based access control. And if you're an individual managing a few servers, it's not something that you necessarily need to worry too much about. It's sort of a bit of a binary situation. Puppet Enterprise allows, in a more complex environment or something where there's quite a lot of segregation or regulation or constraints, to specify these in a sort of same way that fits in with how you then run Puppet. We've got a number of tools that allow you to dig into that data. And I mentioned sort of all those reports, all this juicy data ending up in PuppetDB. You can get at the data. Puppet Enterprise provides you with high-level tools that not only allow you just to get at the raw data, but things like this around sort of what's the state of my system at any given time. Let's dig into events that are happening in real time in your infrastructure. We also provide an app to help you classify your nodes. So if you're working in an environment where new nodes are appearing, they have properties, how do you map between the fact you just got a new node and the Puppet code that should be applied to it? How does Puppet know that something is a web server? How does it know it's an application server for this specific application? Well, there'll be metadata available. It might be the host name, it might be other information, it might be part of your provisioning system. The node manager will allow you to take all of those information, take those facts, and determine what Puppet code should be applied to that machine in a rules-based, so scalable way, rather than you having to have this massive list of all your hosts, which is maybe a good way of starting, but once you're adding a new host every 10 minutes, it starts to get a bit boring. Puppet 3.8 as well is shipping with a number of tools for provisioning. So moving away from just managing host level resources to managing sort of higher level sort of infrastructure level resources. So whether that's managing network devices, whether that's managing actually Amazon Web Services, or whether it's managing containers. And I'll come back to those with some examples in a moment. And Code Manager is really the extension of R10K, which I mentioned as the open source tool. It's really around that opinionated workflow that we're increasingly seeing people adopt. And one of the really slick things is, again, based on the data that we can get out of the Puppet runs and from the Puppet server, knowing how your code performs is so useful. You want those Puppet runs to be as fast as possible. And so having detailed profiling information and having that available, this is just pushing the data straight from Puppet server into Graphite. And you can do things like the individual function calls in your individual Puppet modules on individual hosts. are taking up most of the space. Let's go optimize them. Super useful for just like digging into the weeds. And as well, there's lots of Puppet modules that provide these types for whether it's the low-level stuff like files and services and packages, or whether it's higher-level things like IIS or Apache. And as part of Enterprise, we actively support some of those for commercial customers. So I touched on some of the new features. I've thrown this in here because some of this is what I've been working on, and I want as much feedback as I can get. So the more people see it, the more feedback I get. So do come see me about any of these. And so one of the things that's definitely been sort of picking up traction is Docker, and more generally sort of containers. And one of the things I've worked on pretty much from when Docker first came out around 2 years ago, so before I joined Puppet Labs, and I've been working on a little bit since joining, and we're now going to be supporting as part of the Puppet Enterprise 3.8 series, is a module to manage Docker. The nice thing there is, if you're sort of thinking, well, Docker's interesting, but there's a lot to learn, it's a new thing, how do I try it out? With Puppet, if you have a Puppet infrastructure, you can just write include Docker, and you're done. Yes, you now need to actually decide how you're going to use Docker, but you've bypassed a lot of the how do I get started. It's new technology, it's changing all the time. And with the Docker module, we're trying to sort of say, actually, just include Docker, and you've got Docker, and now you can find out how it fits with your business. We also provide some higher level bits and pieces to allow you to actually manage individual running containers using Puppet with Docker. And the other sort of thing I've been working on that really extends Puppet from, like I said, being about host level resources into something higher level is support for Amazon Web Services. So whether it's describing security groups or load balancers, whether it's describing entire auto-scaling groups, or whether it's describing DNS, and there's a bunch of other providers in there, and we've got incoming RDS support if you're using that. Again, this is all about having this shared domain-specific language to describe our higher-level infrastructure, and then have this run over and over again, and make sure your infrastructure is in that state. And that works really well in terms of for AWS, where there might be multiple things talking to the API. You might have multiple ways of doing that. People might be logged into the console, people might be using other API clients. Here you can describe all the things that you really, really care about and make sure they're always there. And when they're not, you have that both remediation, i.e. that security group's no longer there or has these rules, quick, let's make it correct again. But you also get the feedback that was changed. So really useful for auditing. And one of the things that I've been enjoying quite a bit, that makes me chuckle, is that now we can write unit tests for our model of our infrastructure. So even before we're rolling out our infrastructure, even before we're creating servers, because that's always going to take a small period of time, we can run unit tests against them to make sure we're not in breach of any of our policies. Maybe you have a policy whereby only these approved AMIs can be used. Well, throw in a unit test, put that in your continuous integration pipeline, and suddenly you've got something to give to your auditors about actually how you're enforcing this. How do you make sure that someone can't just start something up? We've got an answer. I touched briefly on the Puppet 4 and how that's shipping with the new language parser. And there's lots in there around, and I picked out 2 things. Well, I should have picked out 3. One of the things in there for people who've been using Puppet for a while will be like, you should be using the future parser, is the error reporting is much improved. Puppet's always given you lots of information about what's going wrong. Now it gives you much better information about what's going wrong. The error handling is so much better. But things like types as well allow us to write modules that can fail faster and give better information. So it's not just defining a type that takes some messages. It's defining a type that takes some messages, which is an array of strings. And so if someone passes in a number or just a string, we can give immediate feedback that that was a problem. We can add much more detail into our, create much better user interfaces by putting type hints in there. And iteration as well was sort of something I wasn't sure, I wasn't sold on the need for until it's been there, and now I'm using it, and now I don't like doing anything that's not feature parser. It really allows you to cut down code in a few places, but also allows for some things that weren't sane before. I once wrote a recursive defined type. And if you don't know what that is, that's a good thing. If you know what that is, it was as horrifying as you think. And not having to do those sorts of things, having features built into the language, is super useful. So what does all that mean? Why, to an extent? And I mentioned some of the results that came out of the DevOps report, and there'll be more from this year's one as well. And just the numbers were silly, they were frightening. And I think, again, if they're verified in this report, these are the things that, this is what you're right to be here, this is what we're doing the right things. But also, show them to your boss. This is straight up business relevant information about why we should invest in, you, frankly. And there's lots of people using it, and we obviously said there's people in the room who've been using it sort of nearly 5 years. And we've got lots of customers, we've got lots of users who are doing this, and we've got lots of case studies. And I'm not that familiar with a bunch of these from the US, but there's people like Hiscox Insurance in London who are doing some really interesting bits and pieces. Give them a quick shout out. So, if you weren't sold before, hopefully you are now. And hopefully if you were familiar with lots of it, there's still something from here. But if you're interested in trying it, whether that's people who've sort of not been using Puppet for very long and interested to see sort of maybe an opinionated setup, or if you've not used Puppet before, I definitely recommend downloading the Learning VM. It's already got everything set up so you can just get started, and it has a sort of a bunch of challenges right there and then. And because they're sort of scripted, we can give you good feedback, we can give you good answers, and there's a community of people to talk to as well. The Forge is a great place to browse around just to get a feel for the scope of what people are doing with Puppet. There's more than 3,000 modules on there, and so, put your hands up if you've got anything on the Forge. Oh, good few people say thank you, and everyone else should get something on the Forge as well. It's a great way of sort of learning and building a community around your module, and the nice thing with communities around your modules is other people do work for you. It's great. We offer training and certification as well, so we've been doing this, there's a bunch of these courses running in London as well, which is nice and handy. There's also the Puppet Test Pilot program. So if you're really interested in sort of some of the sort of thorny challenges, some of the things you'd like to see Puppet do in the future, some of the things Puppet might be doing in the future, the Test Pilot program it's really all about us doing user research with people who are using Puppet. So you can participate in some of the user research sessions, and they can be done remotely, so it's all sort of fairly light touch. You do get a chance to sort of just influence some of the product decisions, and not just, obviously one way of doing that is sort of more direct open source contribution, but another is literally just we want to know what you think, we want to know what sucks, we want to know what works really well, we want to know what feature if we had, it would be a better product. Plus you get free stuff. My favorite Puppet t-shirt, and there's a ridiculous number of Puppet t-shirts, is still the original Test Pilot one. So you do get cool stuff that's only available if you're part of the Test Pilot program. There's a really nice community of people around Puppet, whether it's IRC, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on the mailing lists, and Puppet user and Puppet dev. And I think people just say the Puppet user community is just really nice, and I think a lot of that's credit to people like Cara and Dawn and Meg for just sort of steering it in the right place. But it's also a massive credit to just everyone turning up and just being nice. It's super interesting. Puppet is nearly always hiring, and I think we're now 360 people or so. Spread out all over the place, so Germany, London, Australia, all across the US, Belgium, Sweden, Czech Republic, Belfast. There's some people from Belfast over today. So we're hiring for all sorts of things as well. So look. And if you do like this sort of event, and you like one that was just a lot bigger, with a lot more content, and everything from super advanced talks to like just getting started stuff, PuppetConf is really good fun. It's in Portland this year, and Portland is really good fun. And it's in October, and my birthday's in October, so you should. It's like lots of stuff. And if you're someone, whether you're just getting started and would like to talk about the sort of the getting started story, or whether you're one of the people who had their hand up saying, yep, I've been using Puppet from 0.27 or whatever, like do submit a talk. We're looking for like talks across the whole spectrum from interesting folks. So, we've left, I think, 5 minutes for questions. And hopefully that was useful, and hopefully that sets up the rest of the day. Thank you. So we've only got 5 minutes for questions, but I'm happy to talk about anything Puppet related, pretty much.
Is this working? Okay, cool. So if you have a question, put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you so that it can actually be heard on the recording.
I have a question about AWS, auto-scaling, and this sort of setup.
Yep, shoot. So
does it provide the same capabilities as AWS, command line tools? Puppet.
So the question there is around the Amazon Web Service resources, and specifically around the auto-scaling groups. So how that's working is you describe in Puppet the auto-scaling components. So that's auto-scaling groups, launch configurations, CloudWatch alarms, a few other bits and pieces, scaling policies. So you describe all the individual parts within the Puppet DSL, and then Puppet will basically make sure they exist. So it will create them if they're not there, it will change them to be in the state you've described if they're there and wrong. So you can manage those going forward, at which point the auto-scaling groups themselves will be launching instances. So it doesn't quite have 100% API feature parity yet, but that's the sort of yet. And what we've put out there covers most of what most people will want to do. And there's a number of people, myself included, inside and outside Puppet Labs. It's open source, so anyone can use it. We've had a number of contributions already. So if there's a feature missing, come let us know. Just open an issue. If you're really interested in adding a feature, even better, come let us know, and we're happy to help. Cara, question again?
It's basically addition to the question before. Is it any kind of mapping for CloudFormation from AWS? Because this part was, at least for me, quite missing for Puppet, that your infrastructure not immutable. If I was running to create some file, I need to ensure that this file was deleted. And if you can spin up for me like entire infrastructure, and after like execute like provisioning afterwards, it would make my life much easier and happier.
Yep. So the question there is around, I think, the sort of step after you have your infrastructure, but also tying in with CloudFormation. So the AWS module at the moment doesn't have CloudFormation support, but I've sketched it out. We're going to add it. It's one of the things that will allow us to have support for all of the resources much more easily. So you can describe some of the high-level stuff in Puppet, and you can describe anything else in CloudFormation. When it comes to, and this is true whether it's on Amazon or any sort of dynamic provisioning environment, the typical patterns are around like you've got a new machine. The best approach there is to sort of part bake that in terms of have Puppet on there already, have a build process that uses Puppet to apply, like install things that are going to take a long time. They're going to download from a package repository. So get all the packages, get all the bits and pieces on there, and just do the last mile config when the machine comes up. And I think how I've been doing that is the machine comes up and the module allows you to pass basically cloud init information. And obviously that information can provide just the last bit of configuration, bootstrap the Puppet agent to the master, and then agent calls master. You do auto-signing based on the Amazon API, so using the policy-based auto-signing. I need to do some examples and diagrams of that, because it's a little bit interesting, but very powerful. and then your machine is very, very quickly converged to the state you want it in, and like you're on to the next one, or the next 10, or the next 100, and then it's torn back down again. Hopefully that answers the question. Just one more down here.
Hi, I had a question about the Docker support.
Yep.
You mentioned that there might be, either there was support already for provisioning a Docker instance, maybe without a Docker file. Is that something that's happening via Puppet, or do you still need to use a Docker file?
So, the question there is around, do you still have to use a Docker file? The current module that's there will allow you to manage a running container and spawn a container based on any image. And the image support in Puppet will allow you to create one based on a Docker file or pulling from a repository. That doesn't solve the build it with Puppet problem. I may or may not have a prototype where I'm doing something where you don't need, you can basically just go straight from a manifest to a container. I was talking with some of the Docker Inc. folks actually last night about ultimately the build API for Docker. Docker file isn't a client of the API, it's the transport, which limits the things you can do as if you want to build a better build tool. That's probably going to change, and I'm talking to some of the Docker folks about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gareth. So I know we're out of time for questions right now, but if you've got more questions, we're going to have a Puppet demo later in the day that Stephen Thwaites is going to be giving, and you can ask Stephen questions then, and you can also ask Gareth questions then. We'll have a lot more time for questions. You can also find folks at the break, so there's going to be plenty of opportunities to kind of get that stuff in. So I think David's going to come up to the stage and plug in. Thank you again, Gareth.